So are we in Matthew or John this week?
Actually, we're going to be looking into one of the ones we've been dancing around for a while.
Which one's that?
Mark.
Mark's
Mark.
in Mark's Gospel.
Mark.
So we've been dancing around it for a while, but this week our video will hit the
Don't say it.
hit the mark.
You're not funny. I'm going back to camp.
I'm a comedian.
The Gospel of Mark is generally considered to be the first gospel written, although it wasn't always that way. When the Bible was being compiled, especially by Augustine, many thought that Matthew's Gospel was the first one to be written, which is why in our current Bibles, Matthew is the first Gospel. But after further study of the book, it is more generally accepted now that Mark was in fact the first Gospel to be written.
Mark is the shortest of the four Gospels, and approximately 90% of the stories found in Mark are found in either Matthew or Luke, leading many to assume that both Matthew and Luke drew upon the Gospel of Mark for inspiration.
The Gospel of Mark was written by John Mark, and there is widespread evidence to believe that John Mark was Peter's scribe, and so the Gospel of Mark was written from Peter's report.
Non-canonical writings from Papias, preserved by Eusebius of Caesarea, state that Mark was the writer for Peter, and he wrote everything Peter told him with as much accuracy as he could, but he was not an eyewitness or disciple of Jesus. But it was also not his desire to misrepresent or omit anything.
Although Mark is the shortest of the four Gospels, it's also the most action-packed. Mark was a big fan of the Greek word euthus, which generally translates to immediately, and this word occurs 41 times in Mark's 16 chapters.
Now, this word doesn't always mean right afterwards, but it serves as a way of driving the story forwards. This gives it a more urgent, action-packed feel, and Mark is more focused on action than teaching. We see this as there are only 2 discords, but 20 accounts of miracles.
In the context leading up to this week's good question, we see a turning point in both Jesus' ministry and in Mark's Gospel, as Jesus is concluding his Galilean ministry and beginning his journey to Jerusalem and ultimately the cross.
In this season, we see Jesus begin to prepare his disciples for his death. His method of teaching them also denotes a change in fulfillment of his words in John 16:25, as he speaks plainly to them about his impending death and resurrection.
Now, the disciples were not a fan of this new teaching, and Peter actually begins to rebuke Jesus. Now, in the context of a master-to-disciple relationship, this is audacious to do. A student would never correct a teacher, let alone rebuke them. And so Peter is not in a position to do this, and his actions are way out of line.
Peter, like many of his fellow Jews, has unfortunately fallen victim to resisting the idea that the Messiah must suffer, even though it was prophesied in the Old Testament. Jesus, turning to his disciples in verse 33, shows that his rebuke was intended for all of them, and it identifies the source of their false assumptions, rather than labeling Peter himself as the devil.
Mark 8:34 starts a heavy teaching that serves as the main point or thesis behind verses 34 through 38. Jesus tells of the cost of following him, and verses 35 through 38 offer supporting points to push the severity of Jesus' words. Each verse in Greek uses the same word, gar, which translates to our English word for, which is often used in similar respects to the English word because, and is sometimes used in the Bible to offer clarity to a statement preceding it. So our good question this week, while a question, is a question used to stress the point and also serves as an explanation to verse 34.
With all this information in mind, let's look at our good question.
For what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world, yet forfeits his soul?
So we ask you, what does following Jesus cost you? And are you willing to lay down anything that Jesus might ask of you and sacrifice for the gospel?
And if following Jesus hasn't cost you anything, and you aren't willing to take up your cross, can you truly say you're a follower of Jesus?
We encourage you to be praying and thinking about these questions and this passage as we come into Sunday morning.
Come in. Hey.
Hey, I had some good ideas for our next video.
Oh, about that.